After 9 years of building his career on my back, my venture capitalist husband walked into my hospital room the morning after I lost our baby, set a stack of divorce papers on my tray table, and told me the timing finally worked out. "You were never going to bounce back from this fast enough anyway," he said. "I need a wife who can host, not one who's falling apart in a hospital bed." He had no idea that the quiet woman renting the guest cottage on the property next to my sister's house was the majority owner of the private equity fund that had just quietly acquired his firm's largest client. My name is Renee Foster, 34 years old, and for almost a decade I told myself that if I just worked a little harder, gave a little more, and asked for a little less, my marriage would finally feel like a partnership instead of a performance review. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from. If you've ever had someone use your worst moment as their exit strategy, stay with me, because this isn't a story about heartbreak. It's a story about a woman who stopped asking for permission to be angry. I woke up in recovery, still groggy from the anesthesia, my hand instinctively moving to my stomach before my mind caught up with what my body already knew. The nurse had been kind the night before, gentle in the way people are when there's nothing left to say that won't sound hollow. I'd lost the pregnancy at 19 weeks, a girl we'd already started calling Junebug because of the due date. My husband, Marcus Halloway, 37, founder and managing partner of Halloway Ventures, had been in Aspen closing a term sheet when it happened. He'd flown back the next morning, walked into my room in a cashmere sweater that still smelled like someone else's fireplace, and stood at the foot of my bed with the specific stillness of a man who has already made a decision and is only waiting for the right moment to announce it. I assumed he was in shock. I reached for his hand and told him it wasn't anyone's fault, that the doctors said sometimes these things just happen, that we could try again when I was ready. He didn't take my hand. He set a leather folio on the rolling tray table beside my water pitcher and my untouched Jell-O cup, and he unzipped it with the same brisk efficiency he used at board meetings. "I had my attorney draft these last month," he said. "Before this happened, I want to be honest with you, Renee, this isn't really about the pregnancy. This has been coming for a while." I stared at the papers, the words swimming in front of me. Petition for dissolution of marriage. My own name typed cleanly above his, like a line item. "You're divorcing me the day after I lost our daughter," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, my throat still raw from the intubation. "I'm divorcing you because I need a partner who can actually show up," he said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, which somehow made it worse, just the flat, rehearsed tone of a man delivering quarterly guidance. "I have the Meridian Gala in 10 days. I have investor dinners every week through Q4. I can't have a wife who's going to be crying in the bathroom during a pitch reception because she's grieving. You were never going to bounce back from this fast enough anyway. Better to rip the bandage off now." I want to tell you I screamed. I didn't. 9 years of marriage to Marcus Halloway had trained something in me to go very quiet and very still whenever the ground shifted, because volume never worked with him, and stillness at least gave me time to think. I looked at the folio, at the tab flags his paralegal had helpfully inserted at each signature line, and I asked him, in a voice that didn't sound entirely like mine, whether he had really planned this before I lost the baby. "I told you," he said, checking his watch. "This has been coming for a while. The pregnancy just made the timeline inconvenient." He left before the nurse came back to check my vitals. He didn't kiss my forehead. He didn't ask if I needed anything. He simply zipped the empty folio shut, told me his attorney would be in touch, and walked out of the recovery ward the way he walked out of underperforming meetings, without a backward glance, because in his mind the conversation had already served its purpose, and there was nothing left to extract from it. I spent 3 more days in that hospital, mostly alone. My sister, Camille, flew in from Denver the moment I called her, and she sat with me through the discharge paperwork, through the follow-up appointment, through the long, silent drive back to the house Marcus and I had shared in the hills above Menlo Park, a house I would not be permitted to sleep in for more than 6 more nights, as it turned out, though I didn't know that yet. What I did know, sitting in that hospital bed with an empty folio's worth of legal threats hanging over me, was that I had spent 9 years building Marcus Halloway's career. I had left my own job in institutional research at a mid-sized asset manager the year we got married, because he'd asked me to help him build his firm from the ground up, unofficially, off the books, because a founder's wife doing unpaid strategic work didn't show up on any org chart, but somehow ran half the operation anyway. I had built his investor relations materials. I had personally recruited 3 of his first 5 limited partners through relationships I'd cultivated over a decade in finance. Relationships he then quietly rebranded as his own network at every dinner party for the next 9 years. I had hosted, coordinated, edited, advised, and smiled through hundreds of events where men twice my age asked Marcus where he'd found such a lovely, supportive wife, as though I were an amenity that came bundled with the house. And I had never once put any of it in writing, because when you love someone, or think you do, you don't imagine you'll need a paper trail. The house felt different the moment I walked back into it. Marcus had already had the housekeeper change the sheets in the guest room down the hall from our bedroom, a small, deliberate cruelty disguised as consideration, a message that said, without a single word, that whatever we had shared in that bedroom was now officially over. He was polite to me for the 6 days I stayed there while I figured out where to go. Polite in the specific, chilling way people are polite to someone they've already filed away as a closed account. On the 6th night, Camille called and told me she'd found a small guest cottage on the property next to the house she and her husband had just bought in Los Altos, available immediately, fully furnished, no lease required while I figured things out. I packed 2 suitcases the way people pack when they're leaving a life rather than going on a trip, taking things that mattered and abandoning things that didn't, and I drove away from the house Marcus, and I had shared for 9 years without a single word of protest from him, because by then I understood that protest would have required an audience willing to feel something, and Marcus had made it very clear there was no audience left. The cottage was small, white clapboard, tucked behind an overgrown hedge of rosemary, with a single bedroom, a kitchenette, and a screened porch that looked out over a stretch of undeveloped hillside. It smelled like cedar and rain. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed the first night and let myself finally cry, not just for Marcus, not just for the marriage, but for the daughter I would never hold, in the privacy of a place where no one was watching my face to determine whether I was recovering fast enough for their timeline. It was 3 days later that I met Adele. She lived alone in a modest, single-story house on the far side of the same property. A house you might drive past a dozen times without noticing it, tucked behind a stand of live oaks, unremarkable except for the fact that it clearly belonged to someone who had chosen quiet on purpose rather than by circumstance. She was somewhere in her early 60s, silver hair cropped short and practical, dressed most days in canvas work pants and flannel, and she spent her mornings tending an enormous vegetable garden with the kind of focused, unhurried attention most people reserve for things they genuinely love. I assumed, the first time I saw her kneeling in the dirt with a trowel, that she was a retired teacher, or maybe a widow living on a modest pension, someone who had built a small, careful life and intended to keep it that way. She introduced herself simply as Adele Whitfield, no title, no context, and she was the first person in weeks who didn't ask me a single question about what had happened, didn't offer condolences that came with an expiration date, didn't watch my face for signs of whether I was handling things appropriately. She just handed me a basket of tomatoes over the low stone wall between our properties and told me the ones with the cracked skin were the sweetest. And somehow that small, undemanding kindness did more for me in that first week than anything anyone else had said. Over the following 2 weeks, we fell into an easy rhythm. I'd walk over most evenings, and we'd sit on her back porch drinking tea while she pruned something or mended something, and I found myself, slowly and without quite deciding to, telling her everything. About Marcus. About the folio on the hospital tray table. About 9 years of unpaid, unacknowledged labor that had built a firm now worth, by his own boasting at dinner parties, north of $400 million in assets under management. Adele listened the way very few people actually listen, without interrupting, without rushing to reassure me, without turning my pain into an opportunity to talk about herself. It was on one of those evenings, maybe 3 weeks after I'd moved into the cottage, that Camille's husband, Isaiah, mentioned almost offhandedly over dinner that he'd looked into our quiet neighbor out of simple curiosity, the way you do when someone interesting moves in next door, and had discovered that Adele Whitfield was not, in fact, a retired teacher. She was the majority principal of Highmark Capital Partners, a private equity fund with several $billion under management that operated with almost aggressive discretion, avoiding press coverage, avoiding conference circuits, avoiding the kind of visibility most people in finance actively chase. Highmark specialized in acquiring controlling stakes in mid-market financial services firms and their key institutional relationships, often quietly, often before the acquired firm's own leadership fully understood what had happened to their ownership structure. I sat with that information for exactly 1 evening before I understood what it meant. Marcus's firm, Halloway Ventures, depended almost entirely on a single anchor client for nearly 40% of its assets under management, a pension consolidation fund called Beacon Municipal Trust. I knew this not because Marcus had ever discussed his fund's actual financial health with me. He never had, treating the details of his business the way he treated most things involving me, as information I didn't need and wouldn't understand, but because I had personally built the original relationship with Beacon's board 7 years earlier, back when I still had a name of my own in institutional finance, back before I became simply Marcus's wife at every event we attended together. The next time I sat on Adele's porch, I told her carefully, almost testing the words as I said them, that I understood now who she was. She set down her mending, looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, and said simply, "I wondered when you'd figure that out." Then she asked me, in the same unhurried tone she'd used to talk about tomatoes, whether I'd like to tell her more about Beacon Municipal Trust. I want to be honest about what happened over the following month, because I think it matters. I did not go to Adele looking for revenge. I went to her porch every evening because she was kind to me at a time when almost no one else was. But grief has a way of clarifying things, and somewhere in the retelling of my own history, in laying out for a stranger everything I had built and everything Marcus had taken credit for, I started to see my marriage not as a series of personal failures, but as a system, one that had been quietly extracting value from me for 9 years while I supplied the labor and he collected the equity. And once you see a system clearly, it becomes very difficult to keep pretending it was simply bad luck. Adele had already been evaluating a position in Halloway Ventures for entirely unrelated reasons. She told me, part of a broader thesis her fund had on consolidating fragmented wealth management shops with strong institutional relationships and weak internal governance. Halloway Ventures fit the profile almost perfectly. Heavily dependent on a handful of large clients, thinly capitalized beyond its headline assets under management, and run by a founder whose public reputation, built on charisma and an unusually good origin story about bootstrapping his firm from nothing, was, in Adele's words, doing an enormous amount of load-bearing work for a balance sheet that couldn't hold half that weight on its own. What she hadn't had, until she started talking to me on her porch in the evenings, was a detailed, insider's understanding of exactly how fragile that balance sheet actually was, which relationships were personally dependent on Marcus's charm rather than institutionalized within his firm, and which of his largest clients might be persuadable to move their business elsewhere given the right approach from the right person. I told her about Beacon. I told her that the relationship had been built on trust with two specific board members who had worked with me personally for years before Marcus ever entered the picture. Board members who had grown steadily less enthusiastic about Marcus over the past 18 months as he'd become more visible on the conference circuit and less available for the unglamorous relationship maintenance that institutional clients actually require. I told her about a second client, a family office out of Seattle, whose principal had confided in me at a dinner party just 2 months earlier that he found Marcus increasingly difficult to reach and was keeping his options open. Adele listened to all of it with the focused attention of someone doing careful, patient due diligence, and at the end of that conversation, she told me something I've thought about many times since. She said that in her experience, the men who build empires on other people's invisible labor rarely understand how much of their success is actually rented rather than owned, and that the moment the person doing the renting decides to call in the lease, there is usually very little the man can do to stop it, because he never built the muscle to replace what he took for granted. Over the following 6 weeks, while Marcus's attorneys sent increasingly aggressive letters to my own newly retained divorce counsel, demanding I vacate any claim to the house and accept a settlement so small it would barely cover a year of rent, Adele's fund began quietly, methodically building relationships with Beacon Municipal Trust's board. Not through me directly. That would have been both unwise and unnecessary, but through Highmark's own institutional sales team, armed with exactly the kind of relationship intelligence that Adele's careful evening conversations with me had provided. They didn't need to poach Beacon through some dramatic confrontation. They simply needed to be present, credible, and available at precisely the moment Beacon's board was growing tired of a fund manager who increasingly treated his largest client relationship as a formality rather than a partnership. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for anyone listening to this who might be in a similar position. I never asked Adele to destroy Marcus. I never once said the words, make him pay, or anything close to it. What I did was tell the truth, in detail, to someone who happened to be positioned to act on it. There's a difference between plotting someone's downfall and simply refusing, for the first time in 9 years, to protect a man who had never once protected me. Marcus, meanwhile, had moved forward with a speed that told me exactly how long he had actually been planning this. Within 3 weeks of the divorce filing, he was seen at the Meridian Gala, the same event he'd cited from my hospital bed as a reason he couldn't afford to have a grieving wife, with a woman named Petra, 28, an associate at a competing venture fund who had, according to Camille's careful reconnaissance through the group chats she still had access to from our old social circle, been quietly involved with Marcus for at least 8 months before my miscarriage. The timeline made something in my chest go cold in a way even the divorce papers hadn't managed. 8 months meant he had been building his exit while I was still in the second trimester of a pregnancy he had, at the time, seemed genuinely excited about, at least in the version of excitement he performed at dinner parties. His attorneys pursued the postnuptial agreement I had signed 4 years earlier with an aggression that made clear Marcus intended to walk away with everything. The house, the firm's equity, even a claim to a modest inheritance I'd received from our grandmother. Which the postnup, drafted by his attorney and lightly reviewed by mine during a period when I trusted my husband more than I trusted my own instincts, apparently classified as commingled marital property subject to his approval for disposition. I remember sitting across from my own attorney, a careful, tired woman named Priscilla Accoy, who had seen enough of these cases to stop being surprised by them, as she explained that the postnup was, unfortunately, largely enforceable, and that my realistic best outcome was a settlement in the low 6 figures and a clean exit. I told her I didn't want a clean exit. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside my own head. She told me the truth rarely pays the bills, but she'd do what she could. It was around this time, roughly 2 months after the divorce filing, that Marcus's firm began to experience what industry newsletters would later describe, with careful, lawyer-approved vagueness, as unexpected client attrition. Beacon Municipal Trust announced, in a brief press release that made almost no waves outside a narrow circle of institutional finance publications, that it was transitioning its asset management relationship to Highmark Capital Partners, citing evolving governance priorities. The Seattle family office followed 4 weeks later, moving a portfolio worth nearly $60 million without so much as a farewell call to Marcus, according to a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it to Camille at a fundraiser, purely as gossip, with no idea of the connection I had to any of it. Between the two departures, Halloway Ventures lost just under half its total assets under management in a period of 10 weeks. For a firm that size, dependent on management fees calculated as a percentage of assets, the loss wasn't merely embarrassing. It was existential. Marcus's operating expenses, built for a firm managing $400 million, didn't shrink to match a firm suddenly managing barely half that. His lease on the glass-walled office suite in downtown Palo Alto, his team of associates, his membership at the club where he hosted investor dinners, all of it remained fixed while his revenue collapsed underneath him. I learned most of this secondhand, through Camille's social network and the occasional careful, unhurried update from Adele on her porch, because Marcus and I were by then communicating exclusively through attorneys. But I did see him once during this period. At a mediation session, neither of our lawyers could avoid scheduling in person, and the change in him was already visible. He had lost weight in the specific, unhealthy way that comes from stress rather than discipline. His suit, once tailored to a precision that made him look effortlessly successful, now hung slightly loose at the shoulders. He barely looked at me across the conference table, and when he did, there was none of the cool, dismissive confidence from the hospital room. There was something closer to bewilderment, the expression of a man who has built his entire identity on being the smartest person in every room, and has just started to suspect that someone, somewhere, has been several steps ahead of him without his ever noticing. He offered, during that mediation, a settlement significantly more generous than his attorneys had proposed a month earlier, a settlement that would have given me the equity in a small investment account we'd kept jointly and a modest lump sum, in exchange for what his attorney called an expedited, amicable resolution. My attorney, watching him carefully, told me afterward that she suspected he needed the divorce finalized quickly and quietly, before word of his firm's collapsing client base reached the limited partners he still had left, because an active, contentious divorce involving a firm founder tends to spook institutional money in ways that a clean, low-drama separation does not. I took the settlement, not because I forgave him, and not because I thought it was fair given 9 years of unpaid labor, but because Priscilla was right that the truth rarely pays the bills, and because I had already gotten something from this process that mattered more to me than a larger number in a bank account. I had gotten to watch, slowly, and without ever lifting a finger against him directly, the specific architecture of his success reveal itself as exactly as fragile as I had always privately suspected it was. What Marcus never fully understood, and what I only pieced together myself over the following months through Adele's careful, unhurried explanations, was that Highmark's interest in Beacon and the Seattle family office had nothing personal in it from Adele's side. She would have pursued those relationships regardless of who I was or what had happened to me, because they fit her funds acquisition thesis, independent of any grudge. What I had given her wasn't a plot. It was simply better information than she otherwise would have had, delivered faster, and with more precision than her own research team could have assembled on their own timeline. I hadn't destroyed Marcus's business. I had simply stopped protecting it, and it turned out that protection, unpaid and invisible for 9 years, had been load-bearing in ways neither of us had ever said out loud. The divorce was finalized 4 months after that hospital room conversation, on a gray Tuesday morning in a courthouse in San Jose, with neither Marcus nor his new girlfriend present, only our respective attorneys and the particular hollow quiet of a marriage being formally converted into paperwork. I remember walking out of the courthouse and standing on the steps for a long moment, waiting to feel the devastation I'd been braced for since the hospital room, and instead feeling something closer to the specific lightness of setting down a bag you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years. I moved out of the cottage 6 weeks later, not because Adele asked me to. She never once suggested I should leave, but because I had, almost without noticing it happening, begun building something of my own. Adele had offered me a position at Highmark early in our friendship. Initially, I think, simply to give me something to focus on during the worst of the grief, a junior research role helping her team evaluate exactly the kind of relationship-dependent financial services firms she specialized in acquiring. I turned out to be good at it, unsurprisingly, given that I'd spent 9 years unofficially running the relationship side of a firm I received no formal credit for. Within a year, I had moved from junior research into a client relationships director role, overseeing exactly the kind of institutional trust building I had once done for free, for a man who had used my hospital bed as a business meeting. Before I tell you what happened to Marcus, I want to back up and tell you about the 6 weeks between the mediation session and the day the divorce was finalized, because that stretch of time taught me more about who I actually was than the previous 9 years of marriage combined. The mediation had gone better than my attorney expected, but better in a collapsing divorce still meant weeks of grinding logistics. Appraisers walking through the house Marcus, and I had shared, forensic accountants combing through joint statements looking for anything that might complicate the post-nup's clean lines. A parade of small, bureaucratic humiliations that made the end of a marriage feel less like grief and more like an audit. I spent most of those weeks either in Priscilla's office or on Adele's porch, and it was on the porch, one particularly cold evening in late October, that Adele finally told me her own story, unprompted, in the same unhurried voice she used for everything. She told me she'd started her career in the 1980s at a firm that, at the time, employed exactly 2 women in any position above receptionist, and that she'd spent the first decade of her career watching men with a fraction of her analytical skill get promoted past her because they were, in the language of the time, a better cultural fit. She told me about a business partner. Decades ago now, a man named Harlan she'd co-founded her first fund with, who had, in the final year of that partnership, quietly maneuvered to have her diluted out of her own equity stake, using a clause in their founding documents that she herself had helped draft back when she'd trusted him too much to read the fine print as carefully as she should have. She told me it had taken her almost 4 years to rebuild afterward, working under other people at other firms, before she'd finally raised the capital to start Highmark on her own terms, with an ironclad rule from day one that she would never again build anything she didn't fully, legally own. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me," she said, snipping a dead branch off a rosemary bush with the same precision she brought to a term sheet. "I'm telling you because I recognized something in you the first week you moved in. You've been managing someone else's asset for 9 years and calling it love. I did the same thing, just with a business partner instead of a husband. The mechanism is identical. Somebody convinces you that your value is contingent on their success, and by the time you understand that isn't true, you've already given away most of what you built." I asked her that night why she'd never remarried, never publicly rebuilt anything close to what Harlan had taken from her in a way that made headlines or settled old scores. She smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her, and told me that headlines were for people who needed an audience to know they'd won. She said the only scoreboard that had ever mattered to her was the one on her own balance sheet, and that Harlan, last she'd checked, was managing a modest family office in Scottsdale, quietly irrelevant, while Highmark had grown into something he could no longer even pretend to understand. "That's not revenge," she said. "That's just what happens when you stop needing someone else's permission to be the main character of your own story." I thought about that conversation constantly over the following weeks, especially during a specific afternoon I still remember in painful detail. The day I went back to the house, under the strict supervision of both attorneys, to collect the last of my belongings before the final walkthrough for the sale. Marcus wasn't required to be present, and for most of the morning he wasn't, which made it easier, cataloging 9 years of a shared life into boxes labeled simply keep and leave, deciding in real time which memories were worth the shelf space in whatever came next. He arrived, unannounced, around 1 in the afternoon, while I was in the study going through a filing cabinet that held, among other things, the original pitch deck I had built for his very first fundraising round 9 years earlier, back when Halloway Ventures was 2 people and a shared laptop, back before he'd learned to tell the story of his own bootstrapping without mentioning that the deck, the financial model, and half the initial investor introductions had come from me. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching me hold that deck, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. "You can have that if you want it," he said finally, his voice carrying none of the cold efficiency from the hospital room. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen from him in years, the specific tiredness of a man whose calendar had started filling up with calls he didn't want to take. "I don't need it anymore. Feels like a different lifetime." I told him it was strange to hear him say that, given that the entire firm he'd built his identity around had come directly out of that deck and the relationships behind it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've turned over in my mind many times since, because I think it was the closest he ever came, before or after, to admitting what he'd actually done. "I know you built more of it than I ever gave you credit for," he said. "I told myself for years that once the firm was big enough it wouldn't matter where it started, that the size of it would just absorb the history. I didn't expect Beacon to leave. I didn't expect any of it to unravel this fast." He looked at me then, and for the first time since the recovery ward, there was something almost like fear in his expression. "Did you have anything to do with that?" I remember standing very still, the pitch deck heavy in my hands, and thinking about Adele's rosemary bush and her 4 years of quiet rebuilding and her rule about never again building something she didn't fully own. I told him the truth, because it was the truth, and because I had finally stopped needing him to believe a version of me that made him comfortable. I told a friend the truth about how your business actually worked, I said. I didn't ask her to do anything with it. She's very good at her job. That's not my fault, and it's not really my problem either. He didn't say anything else. He turned and walked out of the study, and I heard the front door close a few minutes later, and that was the last real conversation we ever had that wasn't conducted through attorneys. The final walkthrough happened without him 3 days later. I signed the last of the property transfer documents in Priscilla's office, standing at a tall window that looked out over the parking structure, and I remember feeling, for the first time in months, something that wasn't grief or rage or the low-grade exhaustion of managing a collapsing marriage on top of managing my own grief. I felt curious. I felt oddly, like I was standing at the beginning of something instead of the end of it, which surprised me enough that I mentioned it to Priscilla, who told me, with the flat, weary wisdom of someone who had seen hundreds of these cases, that the ones who survive divorce well are almost never the ones who win the biggest settlement. They're the ones who stop asking the process to give them back what it can't, and start asking, instead, what they're going to build with what's left. There is one more scene from that period I want to tell you about, because I think it's the moment the whole story actually turned, more than the mediation, more than the final signature. It happened at the Meridian Foundation's Winter Gala, 8 months after the hospital room, an event Marcus had attended the year before with Petra on his arm while I was still legally, if not practically, his wife. I had not planned to attend. I had, in fact, specifically avoided every event on the finance social calendar that overlapped with anyone from our old circle, because grief plus public scrutiny is a combination I had learned, the hard way, to avoid. But Highmark was a major sponsor of the Meridian Foundation that year, part of Adele's broader, low-profile philanthropic footprint, and as the newly promoted Client Relationships Director, my presence at the gala was, Adele told me gently but firmly, not optional, and also, I think, good for you. I spent an unreasonable amount of time deciding what to wear, which felt, in hindsight, like its own small act of reclamation, choosing a deep emerald dress that had nothing to do with what anyone else might think of it, and everything to do with how it made me feel standing in front of my own mirror for the first time in almost a year. Marcus was there. Of course he was there. The finance world in that part of the country is smaller than it likes to pretend, and avoiding every event he might attend would have meant avoiding my entire professional life indefinitely. He was there without Petra, whose departure I hadn't yet learned about at that point, standing near the bar with the specific posture of a man trying very hard to look like he belonged in a room that had started, subtly but unmistakably, to treat him differently than it had a year earlier. I watched, from across the ballroom. As a hedge fund manager he'd once courted aggressively for a co-investment, offered him a handshake that lasted exactly as long as politeness required, and not a second longer. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. What happened instead was smaller and, I think, more honest than any confrontation I could have staged. Adele, standing beside me near the auction tables, watched him for a long moment with the same unhurried, assessing expression she brought to everything. And then she said, quietly, not unkindly, "That's a man watching his own reputation evaporate in real time and not understanding why. It's always strange to watch. They never see it coming, because they've spent so long assuming the room was theirs by default." Marcus saw me eventually, across the ballroom, somewhere around the second course. I watched something complicated move across his face, recognition and something else beneath it, maybe shame, maybe simple confusion at seeing me standing comfortably beside the woman whose fund had just quietly dismantled half his client base, though I don't think he'd yet connected those two facts. He didn't approach me. I don't think he had the nerve to, not in a room full of people who were already starting to whisper about Beacon's departure. He left before dessert was served, and I remember Camille, who'd come as my date for the evening, leaning over and saying, "That's the least powerful I've ever seen that man look in a room." And I remember laughing, actually laughing, for what felt like the first time in a year, not because his misery gave me joy exactly, but because I finally understood, watching him leave that ballroom alone, that I had stopped organizing my emotional life around his opinion of me. That understanding felt, in that moment, like the truest ending the marriage ever got, truer than the courthouse steps, truer than the signature on the final settlement. I want to tell you what happened to Marcus after that, because I think the ending matters. Halloway Ventures never fully recovered from losing Beacon and the Seattle account. Without the assets under management to support his operating costs, Marcus was forced to lay off most of his junior team within a year, sublease his glass-walled office suite to a firm a third its size, and eventually merge what remained of his fund into a larger, less prestigious asset manager as a junior partner, a title that would have been unthinkable to him 3 years earlier. His relationship with Petra, the associate he'd left me for, dissolved within 18 months, according to Camille's still-active network, reportedly because Petra had, in her own words to a mutual friend, signed up for a rising star, not a cautionary tale. I don't take pleasure in reciting all of this the way I might have in the rawest weeks right after the hospital, when I would have wanted every detail of his downfall laid out like evidence in a trial only I was allowed to judge. What I feel now, 4 years later, sitting on my own porch in a house I bought with my own name on the deed, using money I earned doing work I'm actually credited for, is something quieter than triumph. It's closer to relief, the specific relief of finally understanding that the version of myself Marcus tried to convince me was too broken to be useful was never the truth. It was simply the story he needed to tell himself to justify what he was already planning to do. I still have dinner with Adele most Sundays. She slowed down a little, spends more time in the garden than in the office these days, though she still reviews every major acquisition Highmark makes with the same unhurried, exacting attention she brought to our porch conversations 4 years ago. She never talks about what happened to Marcus's firm as though it were a favor she did me. She talks about it, when it comes up at all, as a straightforward business decision that happened to align with the truth I told her, and I think that's exactly right. I didn't need her to burn my marriage down for me. I just needed one person, at the moment I had nothing left, to actually listen to what I'd built and ask what it might be worth. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've had 4 years to think about what it might be, I think it's this. The people who build their success on your invisible labor are rarely as strong as they appear, because strength that depends on someone else's silence isn't really strength at all. It's a loan, quietly extended, that eventually comes due. You don't have to scream to collect on it. Sometimes you just have to stop paying the interest, sit very still, and let the truth do the rest of the work on its own schedule. I think about the version of myself in that hospital bed sometimes, the one who reached for her husband's hand and got a folio of divorce papers instead. I wish I could tell her that the worst morning of her life was also, without either of them knowing it yet, the last morning she would ever spend making herself smaller to keep someone else comfortable. She didn't know yet that the quiet woman 2 houses over, kneeling in a vegetable garden with dirt under her fingernails, was about to teach her that the most powerful thing you can do after someone tries to erase you is simply tell the truth to the right person, and then let your own life get large enough that the lie can't fit inside it anymore. That's the whole story. Not a single scream, not a single scene, not a single moment of dramatic confrontation across a crowded room. Just a woman who stopped protecting a man who had never once protected her, and let the truth quietly, patiently, do what it always does when you finally stop standing in its way.